Lewis Wall.
Malo lava le soifua le fofonga whetalai. It's my pleasure to take a call on this, the second reading of the Social Security Extension of Young Person Services and Remedial Matters Amendment Bill as Labour's youth spokesperson. So I've not had much to do with the passage of this particular piece of legislation, but obviously I'm incredibly interested in it. And what I've done is take the time just to read through as much of the material as possible and just to simplify it. So I'm going to share that with the House, Mr. Speaker. This piece of legislation is about amending the Social Security Act 1964 and extending the youth service. It is going to apply to all 19-year-old beneficiaries with children and 18 and 9-year-old beneficiaries without children who are considered to be at significant risk of long-term welfare dependency. So, Mr. Speaker, they are the who, but the who actually is incredibly important if you look at two particular submissions to the Select Committee, and I'd like to quote from those submissions. The first was from the Salvation Army, and they say that in general the Salvation Army opposes the intent and much of the content of the bill. The principal reason for this opposition is that the Army believes that it is both paternalistic and somewhat contradictory to treat 18 and 19-year-olds in the same way as 16 and 17-year-olds. The Army believes that it is important to respect individuals' legal and civil rights ahead of particular policy objectives, which may in themselves be of questionable value. It is the Army's opinion that the proposed extension of young person services and the associated obligations and sanctions to 18 and 9-year-olds is a clear example of the state placing its policy objectives ahead of the legitimate rights of citizens, and that is a practice that is unwise and unfair. I'd now like to quote from the Human Rights Commission submission, and I found it interesting that, and I quote, "The Attorney General's report on the bill's consistency with the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act notes that the bill discriminates against young beneficiary parents and at-risk 18 and 19-year-olds on the grounds of age." So, Mr. Speaker, I find it really interesting that the who, in terms of, will be impacted most by this piece of legislation. We've had two organisations say that actually it's discriminatory, this legislation shouldn't be taking choices away from that cohort. And a previous bill that we discussed in this House, and I'm glad my colleague, the Honourable Annette King, is here, because on the 11th of May this year, Mr. Speaker, in the committee stage debate on the Health Protection Amendment Bill, there was lots of debate about whether we should ban sunbeds. And the National Party position in that debate was that no, we shouldn't, because we should protect children, that's fair enough, those are up to the age of 18, but in fact if you're over 18, you're an adult. And so we shouldn't take away your rights. And so that was the philosophical positioning of both the Minister in that speech, in that particular debate, Dr. Jonathan Coleman and Simon O'Connor, who is the Chair of the Health Select Committee. So I wanted to highlight the who, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the why, actually the why is very clear, because the why is all about the money. The Better Public Services framework, I suppose, has a reduced long-term welfare dependency objective, which actually is about reducing beneficiary numbers by 25% and the overall cost, not investment, everybody, by $13 billion. So that's actually the driver of this piece of legislation. The government can talk about investment and talk about valuing young people, but actually at the end of the day, their primary objective is to save money. So let's just put that on the table. That's the why. So then we look at the what, because how they plan to do all this is through a youth service, and I actually took the time to download the report because the youth service actually was established in August 2012 to address extremely high risk of long-term benefit dependency. So the youth service was established with the objective of helping a group of vulnerable young people. And there was a report that was produced after the first 18 months of the service, and I have that particular evaluation. And what I'd like to highlight from that evaluation, Mr. Speaker, is this, which is at the bottom of page 1. Many young people who enter youth service have serious or complex issues that require intensive support. For example, a review of youth payment grants by work and income found that 38% of applicants were victims of domestic violence, 76% suffered emotional neglect, and 5% were homeless or victims of sexual abuse. And I think, for me, the most important aspect of that analysis is, okay, how do we support the young people who, for no fault of their own, are living in those circumstances? And so if the underlying intent of this piece of legislation was actually to put in the services and support so this group of vulnerable young people had their needs met, then actually I think we would support that 100%. Because one of the other aspects of this piece of legislation is around the whole risk assessment, risk modelling. How are we going to find these young people who actually we're going to treat as children? How do we find them? And so I'd like to acknowledge that the Greens actually wrote within the Select Committee report a minority report, and they're opposing it. And they're opposing it on solid grounds. But one of the things that they highlighted was that the risks actually, who knows what they will be. They may be about whether they've been in SIFs, they may be based on gender. I think the Minister's alluded that educational outcomes and reason for leaving school were some of the reasons. But what we do know, Mr Speaker, is that from 2013 the government actually has been working quite seriously in this issue. And for example, there's a government data project, and they were looking at 4 indicators actually, and it was about whether or not children had been engaged with SIF and there was a finding of abuse or neglect, whether or not there were long-term dependency issues in those families, whether or not a parent had a corrective sentence, and whether or not the mother had a formal qualification. But the interesting thing to note about that data project actually was that they looked at different cohorts of children. So they looked at the 0 to 5 cohort, the 6 to 14 cohort, the 15 to 24 cohort. And I wonder, based on all that information, why they're not dealing with the 0 to 5 cohort. Why isn't there a whole lot of investment going into those children really early on in their lives, making sure they had a house, making sure that they roof over their head, kai in their puku, mum's well supported. Yes, she's getting support to be a better parent, budgeting advice. We're going to make it easy for her to get further education, and we're going to make their lives much better. But no, this government would rather wait till they're 18 and 19-year-olds, and they'll use a big hammer on these kids. And that's part of the issue that we have, Mr Speaker, with this piece of legislation. The other key thing I'd like to highlight is that, and this is from the Greens minority report, but it actually was a submission or concerns raised by Kay Brereton of the National Beneficiary Advocacy Group. And what's her name, sorry? Kay Brereton. And so what she said, or what's written here, is that they support wraparound services, but express the view, Mr Speaker, that, and I quote, making young people's income dependent on meeting certain obligations fundamentally changed for the worst the relationship between the young people and the people in a position to help them. So basically what that means is telling young people what to do actually is going to have the opposite effect to what we want it to do. And so that's a fundamental flaw in this piece of legislation. And so I hope the Minister has been listening to my contribution, given I've taken the time to read through everything and to contribute to the second reading debate. But I do want to reiterate what my colleague and lead for our on the Select Committee and in the Social Development portfolio, Carmel Cepoloni, said. We will be proposing a number of amendments to this piece of legislation, and I think we're really clear that if the government doesn't want to listen, won't support some of the amendments that we propose based on quotes from people like Kay, then in fact we will not support this piece of legislation because we do not believe that it's in the best interests of young people. Kia ora.
John O'Naylor.